Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning. It's great to have you here. It's great to have some of you back for the first time, I'm sure, in a while. I was talking to two different families last Sunday. They told me it was their first time back in the building since COVID began. We think that's awesome. We're excited to see more and more of our church family back to on-site worship. And the reason why we're excited is because we've missed you. We've missed seeing so many of you over the past 18 months. And you know, when you think about it, there's a lot of things that we have missed over the past 18 months, haven't we? As individuals, as a society. I know every once in a while in our home, we kind of reminisce about the things that we miss. And always at the top of our list, this shows our life is pretty good, that this is the top of our list. But often at the top of our list is we talk about how much we miss going on vacation to the States. One of the things our family loves to do is just get away south of the border, enjoy some time away. And, you know, ever since our kids were born, one of the things we've done, it's kind of been a winter tradition, is we head down to Florida and enjoy about 10 days in the sun. And so this is a picture I found of Evan. This is his first year in Florida. You can see the palm trees behind us. And there's his big sister, Abby, who's in her bathing suit with her doll and her accessories. She's all ready for a fun day at the pool. And you know what's interesting is ever since we started going to Florida, or really any warm destination, our kids' favorite thing to do is to go tubing in the lazy river. You can see Abby there when she was a little girl. And here she is just this past week, you know, as a 12-year-old. And even though our kids are now 10 and 12, it's still their favorite thing to do. They always say, Dad, like when we're going on vacation, Dad, just find us a place, a resort. Find us a hotel, a condo with a lazy river, and we will be happy. And so that's kind of been hard to do over the last 18 months because all of the places we're familiar with happen to be south of the border, and we haven't been able to make that trek yet. So this summer, this past July, we decided to improvise. It was the first time that my side of the family were able to all get together at the same time. And so we met up at my parents' place, which is in Paris, Ontario. And we went to Canadian Tire, and we bought like $400 of these things, right? These tubes. And we decided one sunny afternoon that we would all get into the Grand River just south of the dam and float down the river for the day. And we had a blast. I got a picture here that I think my sister snapped as we were getting into the river. And we had so much fun that we decided to do it again a month later. We drove back up and did the same thing again. If you've never tubed a river, just out of curiosity, how many people here have tubed a river? Oh, quite a few of you. You guys are pros. All right. So one of the great things about tubing a river is there's not really anything you have to do. Like it requires no athletic ability from you. The only athletic thing you have to do is squat down and get in it. All right. So you just kind of sit back and you get you get in it like this. And you put your feet up, right? And you got your headrest here, so you don't have to hurt your neck. And I always get ones with cup holders, so you can put two, ice cold Pepsis there beside me. And you just float down the river. Every once in a while, someone will yell, "Butt up," because you're going through the rapids and there's some rocks, and so you go like this, so you don't get a sore rear end. But that's basically all there is to it. So you might be wondering, why are you talking about this, right? It's mostly because I've always wanted to preach lying down on the stage, and I figured this was the only way I could do it. No, in all seriousness, the reason I'm telling you about this is because I just told you I bought like $400 worth of these things, and so I need to start renting them out to get my money back. And so if you'd like to borrow one, $5 a day, you can borrow one of my rafts. No, in all seriousness, the reason I'm telling you this is because I want to talk to you today about how all of us live in culture. And living in culture is kind of like tubing down a river, because whatever culture you live in is gonna drift you in a certain direction, just like tubing in a river the current's gonna pull you down river. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. And really, I want to acknowledge this on the front end, because the reality is many of you that are here today or watching today are Christians, and just like all different sorts of people in our world, we try and create subcultures to live with live within the broader mainstream culture, right? To kind of give our lives identity and purpose and security and protection, especially for our kids. And so for me growing up, I grew up in a conservative Christian home, a Christian subculture. And you might have grown up in similar, or you might have grown up in a Mennonite subculture, or you might have grown up in a farming subculture, or you might have grown up in a homeschooling family, that kind of subculture. We all grow up in subcultures, but I was thinking about it this week as I was thinking about culture in general. And, I just realized, regardless of what subculture and as intentional or non-intentional as your parents were with your subculture, the reality is all of us are still influenced by the broader culture in which we live in. It still influences our thinking and our thoughts and our behavior. And so that's just the reality of life. And for many of us, not all of us, but many of us grew up in a North American culture. And so we've been influenced by North American thinking. Anyways, once again, you're like, so why are you telling me this, right? The reason why I'm telling you this is because last September, Pastor Michael and I were meeting with our life group leaders, and we shared with them that one of our greatest concerns about COVID, from a pastoral perspective, not from a health perspective, but from a pastoral perspective, is that it was going to make all of us, like myself included, all of us vulnerable to this, to individualism. And that's exactly really what has happened. We've probably never seen, at least in my lifetime, society more fragmented, more disconnected, more independent, tribalistic, apathetic than in many ways it is right now. And that's concerning because from, a church perspective, missiologists, people who study, the mission of the church, they would say that the greatest threat to Christianity right now is not like atheism or secularism. It's not even, things that we're talking a lot about right now, which is like statism or socialism. They would say that the greatest threat to Christianity is individualism. And so what is individualism? Well, if you're taking notes on our Lake Point app or just on your own piece of paper, I would identify individualism as this. It's a cultural mindset. Like I've noticed that some of you here today, you're wearing glasses, or I assume some of you might have contact lenses in your eyes. And individualism is kind of like that. It's a cultural lens that we look through that influences how we see the world. And at the heart of individualism is this belief, this mantra, this idea that basically says this: I am the center of the universe, right? I am the center of the universe. Now, when I say that out loud, it sounds so ridiculously self-centered that none of us would say this out loud. And yet at the heart of individualism, that is actually the mindset, that I don't see, other people at the center of the universe or a group at large at the center of the universe. I see myself at the center of the universe. It also promotes this idea that I am my own moral conscience. And here's what I mean by that. Often, you hear people, or maybe you've even thought it yourself, but they say, you have no right to tell me how to live my life or criticize my decisions because I'm the one that determines what my values are. And as such, I'm in the best position to discern if or whether or not I'm living out those values. So if anyone's going to judge me, it's going to be me because I determine my values, and then I'm able to best discern if I'm living out those values. Now, the third thing that individualism is all about is this: freedom and fulfillment are my right. Freedom and fulfillment are my right. And this really reflects the American dream, right? Which is rooted in the Declaration of Independence, which says all men are created equal and that everybody has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I would call time out and qualify that and say, I'm not against those things. I want them for me. I want them for you. I want them for my family, for my kids. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But I would also say that they were never meant to be worshiped. Like, we don't find these things in the Bible as like what we're supposed to be pursuing in life. Anyways, I don't want to get into talking about the state specifically. My point is more this, is that Individualism, this thing that we rarely talk about, yet influences almost all of our behavior, it is not a modern day movement. It's not like we can blame the millennials for individualism. The reality is it's a cultural mindset that's been ingrained into our society since the Western world began. You see, in many ways, America was a social experiment built around this idea of radical individualism. And so what happens, and you probably know this, in every culture, there is this tension between placing the emphasis on the group at large versus placing the emphasis on the individual, right? And every society is figuring out where the emphasis should be placed. And so in traditional cultures, the emphasis is always placed at the group at large, often at the expense of the individual who can often feel oppressed or repressed. And so that was the case with European culture pre-Enlightenment. None of you were alive back then, but history tells us that the authority structures in society at times could be very overbearing and abusive. And so when the United States was birthed, what happened is the pendulum just kind of swung the other way, which is so often the case in life, right? When we as humans, when we try to correct something from one generation to the next, we often overcorrect. And so that's what happened with North America, is these nations were founded on this overcorrection, which said, hey, the group at large has too much authority, it's too overbearing, so let's place the emphasis on the individual. And the challenge with that is, left unchecked, it just leads to extreme forms of individualism. Now, my guess is you probably, based on a lot of factors, probably many of you have never heard the word individualism or never really understood it or never really dissected it. And that's just normal because we don't really use that word in society. The word we use would be this: autonomy. Or we might use the word freedom. Right? And these are buzzwords right now in society. Like, these are actually divisive words in society right now because there's just so much tension surrounding the virus and the vaccine and whatnot. And so these words are kind of dividing people right now. But historically in North America, these two words have actually united the hearts and minds of most North Americans because we as a Western civilization really value individualism. I mean, we even as Christians do it. Like, you'll hear Christians say things like this. Maybe you even said it. You said, my faith is between me and God. Or, my religious beliefs are personal. Or this is a one, we heard even before COVID. I don't need to go to church to be a Christian. And what I would simply point out is, none of these statements are actually biblically accurate or correct, and yet we say them authoritatively because we live in a culture that influences our thinking, and we live in a culture that values individualism, and so even as Christians, we would value individualism as well. So my question today for you is this, is we live in a culture that very much values individualism, but is that culture that we're, rafting in, tubing in, is it actually making us happier? Like, are we becoming happier as a people? That's something I think that's worthy of our consideration today. Are we becoming happier people? And it's interesting because for the last decade or so, there's been lots of research done on the science of happiness. Lots and lots of studies to look at what actually makes people happy. Because my guess is, you probably never stopped and thought about what makes me happy, right? And so what they've actually found, researchers have found, is that there's not hundreds of different things that lead to a person's happiness. There's actually 3 or 4 things that determine most people's happiness. And here's the good news. I'll tell you what they are. The first one is this: a few close friends. You see, everybody's happier with a few close friends. A few people that they know and they trust, people that they can be themselves or they can be real. Everyone is happier when they have a few close friends. Second thing, this is not overly politically correct, but people are happier when they grow up in a nuclear family. When they grow up in a home with a mom and a dad who are committed to each other and some brothers and sisters to play with, this actually leads to people's happiness. The third thing is this: meaningful work. It doesn't have to be glorious, doesn't have to be high paying. In fact, it could be zero paying. It's called parenting, right? Like a lot of people, they stay at home, they raise the kids. You don't get paid and it's not glorious, but it doesn't really matter as long as it gives meaning and purpose to your life, as long as it gives you a reason to get out of bed in the morning, right? If it in some small way makes you feel like you're making a difference, then that is one of the 4 things that leads to people's happiness. The 4th is a theology or a philosophy. Now, growing up in church, I would have been told it's Jesus, and I absolutely do believe it's Jesus. But I think if we look broader, we have to respect and honor that people can have different theologies or different philosophies, and as long as it helps them understand life, as long as it especially helps them understand pain and death, right, then that also helps them live a happier life. And the problem with like secularism or naturalism, right, a lot of modern day thoughts, is they don't give any answers to suffering and pain and death and life. And so these are the 4 things typically that are most influential in making a person happy. These 4 things. Now the problem is we live in a culture where in many ways, I'm not trying to be negative, but in many ways all 4 of these things are being hollowed out. They're being eroded from society. Let me just give you an example that's not personal. A few close friends. Did you know, like, in our lifetime, the average North American has gone from saying they have 3.2 close friends to 1.8? Like, just in a few years, the average person says, I have half as many friends as I used to. And then, which is weird, right? Because, like, I have, like, over 1,000 Facebook friends, right? I don't know how many Facebook friends you have, but I have quite a few, and yet we're saying on average we have less friends today. In fact, 40% of Americans say that they have 0 confidants in their life. 0 people that they feel close enough that they could be confidential with. And so that's kind of a problem. Why is that? The reason why it's a problem is because close friendships, definitely family, maybe work, definitely theology and philosophy, all of these things actually require you to surrender freedom and autonomy in order to fully lean in and enjoy them. Pastor and author John Mark Comer, who I love a lot, and some of his thoughts definitely have influenced today's message. He says this, I want to read it to you. He says, you can have autonomy or you can have loving relationships, but he says it's hard, if not impossible, to have both, right? You can have this, or you can have individualism, but you can't really have both. And that's the conundrum that our culture finds itself in. In order to enjoy loving relationships and community, we have to reject hyper-individualism. Now, unfortunately, if we can just kind of like just take a moment to consider the cultural moment we find ourselves in. Unfortunately, even though we all need and want community, what we're seeing in real time right now in the last few years is we're seeing the rise in our society of tribalism. And tribalism is a pseudo sense of community. It's a fake, it's an imposter sense of community. All right? Now, typically, when you think of tribalism, you probably think of, like, I'm not trying to be, like, a discriminatory in any way, but typically, when you think of tribalism, you probably think of, like, some guy, you know, in the jungle with a spear, right? That's what you think of when you think of tribes. But the reality is tribalism is everywhere. It's in every society. And the reason why tribalism isn't God's vision for humanity is because tribalism isn't united around mutual love, which is what genuine community is. Tribalism is rooted around mutual hate, right? It's not what we're for, it's what we're against. That's what makes a tribe. Like, just think of politics in the States, the 2020 election. If you were to survey people, you would actually get this answer, that what unites Democrats is their hatred towards Republicans, right? And what unites Republicans is their hatred towards Democrats. Like, their mutual hatred is stronger than their mutual love. And it's why we as a church here at Lake Point, even though it'd be tempting, we refuse to engage in tribalism or cultural war because it's not God's vision for his church. And so what is God's vision for his church? Well, What we're going to see all throughout Scripture, and I'll just take you to one spot today, but what we see in the teachings of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, what we see in the epistles and from the apostles, is that God's vision for the church is actually beautiful, and it's compelling, and it's way better than individualism or tribalism. In one word, it would be community, loving community. And we get this incredible picture of what this looks like in Romans chapter 12. And so that's where I want to take you today. Romans chapter 12. Romans is a book of the Bible written by the Apostle Paul. It is an amazing theological treatise. It is probably the best theological work we have in all of Scripture. And in the first 11 chapters, the Apostle Paul, he's talking about what God has done for all of creation and what Christ has done for the church. And then he pivots in chapter 12, and he begins to describe now what we need to do to live out what God has done for us, living out this new community that God is creating. And so I want to walk you through all of chapter 12. It won't be long. I'll go quickly, but I want to walk you through an entire chapter of Scripture, and you're welcome to reflect on it as you go about this week. Paul starts by saying this, and so, based on what everything I've just said, he writes, and so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies. This is actually an interesting word. It's very relevant for our society today. To give your bodies to God because of all that he has done for you. Let them be a living, like a daily and holy sacrifice, the kind that he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him. So Paul comes along and he says, you're to give your entire bodies to God, which is just interesting. And I'm not trying to get political at all. I actually do my darnest to not get political from the stage. But it's interesting because, you've probably participated or seen lots of posts on social media the last few weeks about, because it's a contentious issue, my body doesn't belong to the government or my employer or my school, right? And I would agree with that completely. But I would also say that those memes we're sharing, they're not actually Christian memes, because if they were, it would actually end with, my body belongs to the Lord. Right? It's not about personal autonomy. It's not about personal freedom, because actually we're the exact opposite of that as Christians. We actually every day take our whole body and we give it to God. And it's this beautiful picture of worship where you're not just bringing God your faith or your thoughts or your thinking or your doctrine. You're bringing your whole being. You're bringing your body, your sexuality, your soul, your spirit, every part that makes you, you. You bring it to God as an act of worship. And notice too, this isn't very politically correct. Notice, too, how it says, he starts by saying, dear brothers and sisters. That's interesting, especially in the culture they lived in. What Paul is saying is this, is that God's vision for his church is that we would be a family. That we would actually be not individuals, but a family. And I'll come back to that in a moment, but look at what he says next. He says, do not copy the behavior and customs of this world, which if Paul was talking to us today, he would say, do not copy the behaviors and customs of this world, which promotes individualism. You're in it for yourself, which promotes tribalism. You're against another group of people. He says, do not copy those behaviors, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think, and then you'll be able to learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. This is fascinating because what Paul is basically saying is that we're a family, as he said earlier, brothers and sisters, but what unites us as a family is not blood. We're not blood family. We're also not united by ethnicity as a family of God. We're not united by territory, like where we grew up. We're all from Canada. Likewise, we're not a family based on political ideology. But what Paul says is we're a family united on one thing, doing God's will, his good, pleasing, and perfect will for our lives. This is what makes us a family. And then he goes on and he says this in verse 3. He says, because of the privilege and authority God has given me, I give each of you this warning. Don't think that you are better than you really are. Be honest in your own evaluation of yourselves. Don't think you're better than you are. What we're going to see from Paul over and over again, just like we saw from Jesus in his teachings, is that the prerequisite to community is humility. It's one thing. It's humility. Because what we see is that pride always destroys community. And so the prerequisite to enjoying loving community, being a part of God's family, is that we pursue humility. Then he goes on and says this, just as our bodies have many parts and each part has a special function, so it is with Christ's body. And then he says this, we are many parts of one body, and we all belong to each other. Like this is even more bold and more intimate than the first metaphor that he used to describe God's vision for the church. He said we're a family, and we're okay with that. But then he actually says we are a body. Right? We're one body, and we belong to each other. And so what it basically does is Paul takes this whole idea of individualism, and imagine you're driving really fast down the 401. He takes this idea of evangelism, and he chucks it out the window, right? He's like, nah, not in God's kingdom. That's not what we're about. We're not about individuals. Rather, we are a body. God's vision for his church is that we would be a body, that each of us would have a part to play, but we'd all be interconnected and interdependent upon each other. So this summer, I've been going to see my chiropractor a lot because I injured my Achilles tendon, and then I've had really sore ankles all summer, and it's been bothering me a lot. And so I go see my chiropractor, and he's a really good guy, and he always explains not just what he's doing, but what is causing my pain and discomfort. And he's been educating me on how apparently an issue that I've got down here, he says, started up here, right? And I'm just mesmerized by how sophisticated and intricate God designed our bodies. And the same is true with his body, the body of Christ. I mean, I was reading a book this summer, and there's this one statement that I wish I could say it this well, and it's just kind of stuck with me. And I honestly think if we had the time to be contemplative, we could just put the statement on the screen and just look at it for an hour and just let that change our worldview. But this is what the statement said, and it so sums up the New Testament. It said this, one non-negotiable in being a part of God's kingdom, this new humanity, this new community that he's seeking to create, is understanding that God's purposes are not primarily about me, but about us. Like if we were to stop and look at my life and your life and the life of the average Christian North America, we have been so trained by culture to view everything about us, how it impacts us. And yet when we look at God's vision for the church, it's not primarily about me, but it's always about us. And we're going to see this in the next 15 verses of Romans chapter 12. We read this. Paul says, in his grace, God has given us different gifts for doing certain things well. So if God has given you the ability to prophesy, speak out with as much faith as God has given you. And if your gift is serving others, well, then serve them well. And if you're a teacher, teach well. And if your gift is to encourage others, be encouraging. If it's giving, give generously. If God has given you the leadership ability, take that responsibility seriously as well. And if you have a gift for showing kindness to others, do it gladly, right? What we see is that the gifts that God has given you, they're not for you. They're for others. Because God's vision is not that people would do church by themselves, but rather they would be a part of a loving community. And so what Paul's going to do next is kind of beautiful. It's probably a bit more poetic than I can do justice for it. But what we're going to see is Paul's going to list off now 25 short little commands that describe this kind of community that God's inviting us into and to live out of. And so let me just go really quickly through all 25 commands. First one is this. Don't pretend to love others, he says in verse 9. Really love them. So that calls our motive into question, right? You got to be genuine. You got to be sincere in your love. Number 2, hate what is wrong. Number 3, hold tightly to what is good. Number 4, in verse 10, love each other with genuine affection. Number 5, take delight, and this is just literally from the Bible. I'm just adding numbers to it. Take delight in honoring each other. To honor someone is to show appreciation for their unique contributions in the body. And so it begs the question is, when is the last time you've honored somebody in the body, in the family? And then the 6th thing is never be lazy. In fact, Paul says, work hard and serve the Lord enthusiastically. Why? Because when you work hard and serve the Lord enthusiastically, it inspires your brothers and sisters in the body to do the same. Number 8, rejoice in confident hope. Number 9, be patient in trouble. Number 10, keep on praying. These are the things that Pastor Ethan talked about last Sunday, right? When we were looking at James chapter 5. And by the way, we're going to wrap up that series. We're going to wait till after Christmas, the week before the new year. We're going to finish what James has to say in chapter 5 about prayer as we amp up into the new year and get ready for 21 days of prayer and fasting. All right, in verse 13, the 11th short little command Paul makes is this: when God's people are in need, be ready to help them. And then number 12, always be eager to practice hospitality, which has probably been a little bit more difficult, right, the last year and a half. But we're going to actually start a new series next Sunday called Bless. We've been working on this series for the last 6 months. And one of the things we're going to learn in our Bless series is that we want to rediscover this New Testament art of hospitality. Like over and over again, we see in the New Testament how the everyday Christians, they open up their heart and their homes, their meal, their table to other people. And this is one of the ways in which we truly bless the world. And we're going to talk more about that. Anyways, the 13th one is bless those who persecute you. 14, don't curse them, but pray that God would bless them. And so we don't respond as Christians to cultural hostility in kind by giving it back to people. We respond the opposite way. The 15 one, be happy with those who are happy. 16, weep with those who weep. It's inviting us to enter into people's pain and then enter into their success and celebrate with them. Not be envious or jealous, but be happy when people are happy. 17, live in harmony with each other. 18, don't be too proud to enjoy the company of ordinary people. 19, don't think you know it all, right? Like, once again, we see here the heart of God is that humility ushers us into community. Number 20, never repay back evil with more evil. 21, do things in such a way that everyone can see that you are honorable. Both of these actually speak to community. That it's in community we discern how to respond to evil. And it's only in community that people can know that you are honorable, because how would they know unless you explain your motives for how you're acting? And then 22, do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. Don't you hate this one? Because it says, don't just do a little bit of what you can. Like, don't kind of like extend an olive branch and then they disregard you and then you just move on. It says, do all that you can to live in peace. Do everything to seek out reconciliation. And then 23, dear friends, never take revenge. Leave it to the righteous anger of God. For the scriptures say, I will take revenge. I will pay them back, says the Lord. So like I was thinking about the movies I like to watch, and most of them are action thrillers. And almost every action thriller movie in Hollywood it revolves around this plot of revenge. And yet Jesus says, no, not in my kingdom. In my kingdom, you entrust those things to me. 24, instead, if your enemies are hungry, don't throw stones at them or gravel. It says, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. In doing so, you will heap burning coals of shame on their head. We're not to engage in retaliation. We're to engage in bulldozing people, as my wife says, with love. And then 25, don't let evil conquer you, but rather conquer evil by doing good. I just think we need to give a round of applause to God for this incredible, beautiful, compelling vision of what he's inviting us into, loving community. I mean, it's so rich and so good and so countercultural. And so what we see from God is that God's vision for his church is that we would do life together, not as individuals, but life together and in loving community. And so with the time that we have left, just a few more minutes, I want to talk to you just kind of practically, what does that look like? And I think the most practical starting point would just be to acknowledge the different types of relationships that exist within community. I remember when I was, a teenager. It was October 1998, because I keep notes of sermons, and the pastor here at the time was Mark Collins, and he was doing this sermon on relationships and friendships, and he threw some stats out that I kept with me, and I counter-referenced them to studies and research, and this is what we find in society. There's 4 spheres of relationship. There's public, social, personal, and intimate. Now, this research dates all the way back to the 1960s, so it didn't have COVID social distancing worked into it, okay? But it would say generally your public relationships are people that are 12 or more feet removed from you, right? So you see them, you acknowledge them, but you're not in close contact. Social, 4 to 12 feet. Personal, 1.5 to 4 feet. And then intimate is a hug, right? There's no distance between you and that relationship. So let's put these into the context of church, of community, because there's actually some truth we can glean from this here. So level 1, public, 12 or more feet away, 70 plus people. Did you know that the average size church in North America right now is about 75 people? And that's just because for the average person, especially guys, after 75 people, you start forgetting names and faces and stories and whatnot, right? So a lot of people like to be just one close-knit family, and that happens in smaller churches. In a church like ours, not right now, but traditionally, one section would be 75 people. In fact, speaking of autonomy and freedom, you guys are probably going to get too conditioned to it, because let me tell you something. Before we took the pews out, and by the way, we donated them to another church in town, our pews were 10 inches apart. Yeah. And now you're like, oh, lots of freedom, 5-6 feet apart, right? But the reality is pre-COVID, there would be, within a 12-foot radius of you, probably about 70 people that you would say hello to as you walk in and whatnot. Those are your public relationships in church. And then there's your social, 20 to 50 people, 4 to 12 feet away. That's people you're serving with and guest services or family ministries department or production. That's the people in your starting point group and the growth groups you're a part of. Then you got level 3, personal. That's 5 to 12 people. And it's interesting because psychologists say you can only get to really know a true person only about 12 people. That's about the max that you have capacity for, which is what Jesus picked, right? 12 people. And these people, the reason why it's qualified as personal, because like we talked about in our Esther series, they know the real you. They know your shadow mission, right? And then there's the intimate. That's your spouse, 2 to 4 people. That's your best friend. That's your roommate. That's your confidant. Those are the people that really, really know you, right? That you're intimate with. Now, what I don't want you to think is that, in God's kingdom, we need to take every public relationship and bring it to a stage of intimacy. That would be a terrible idea for you and for me and for this church. But that's not at all the goal. The reality, the goal is this, is God's vision for his church is that we would have healthy relationships in all 4 spheres. That we would lean in and participate and enjoy healthy relationships in all 4 of these spheres of relationships. So the problem is, here's the rub. We often don't do this. So for some of us, we just live up here at level 1, right? We come to church, but we don't serve out of the gifts God has given us. We don't participate, in smaller interactions with people. We kind of keep everybody at a 12-foot distance, right? And we don't enjoy these other levels. And then the challenge for some of us is, we just stick right here, level 4, right? We're on the couch watching church at home with our spouse or our close friend, and we don't engage in the perspective of the broader body or engage in loving relationships in all 4 levels. And so that's the challenge for us, is that we can actually lose out on this multi-tiered layers of community that God has designed for all of humanity, and especially for his church. Now, as I close, I would say this. I get that it's difficult, especially right now, right? COVID has changed our world, whether you like it or not. And the reality is we're still dealing with a virus that's threatening. I mean, I've talked to 3 different people in developing nations over the last 2 weeks, and they've all told me stories where they've lost loved ones to COVID. I mean, the reality is that the virus can kill you. The other reality is I don't think it's sustainable for us as human beings to live the same way we've lived over the last 18 months and enjoy the rich sense of community that God has designed for his church. And here's why. It's because of this. It's because living in community is how we become people of love. In fact, I would say it's impossible to become who God invites you to become, a person of love, where you love God and love others, unless you're actually living in community. And so the way forward for us as a church, if you think of last fall, our series, The Way Forward is love, that we would pursue community with other people, right? And I understand that that's complicated. Like here at Lake Point, we're kind of a unique church because we're not tribal. We're not all united on what we're against. We're actually this beautiful blend of different people and personalities. Like our church has about 30% that don't give a rip about COVID. They're not the least bit concerned. They just disregard, COVID. And then we have about 40% that are somewhat concerned. And then we got 30% that are very concerned. And so we're figuring out, what does it look like to live as a family with different degrees of concern? I get that. I get that's complicated. When it's complicated, we have a tendency as individuals to lean out or to attack and blame. But here at Lake Point, we're going to do neither. We're going to lean into love, and we're going to figure this out together. I mean, here at Lake Point, we've been incredibly patient. And when you think of coming out of 3 lockdowns, never once have you heard me or the leadership of this church really urge or demand that everyone gets back to on-site worship. In fact, our numbers over the last 18 months have been 40% our attendance of pre-COVID numbers. So we have 300-400 people on an average Sunday who weren't here that were here pre-COVID. And we're not freaking out because we're patient. And we're going to be patient. We're going to show patience as we continue to give the government and our community and our church family time to continue to educate and protect themselves from the threat of COVID. At the same time, though, this fall, we're going to really encourage you to re-engage in community, to re-engage in life groups and growth groups. And you heard about junior high, to get our students back connected together and to engage in serving and ministry. Because as Pastor Michael shared to our life group leaders a couple weeks ago, without community, we run the risk of losing some really important things. Really important, like authenticity. Without community, we're not real, we're not vulnerable. Without community, we lose out on accountability. Who's there to hold Nate accountable so that he doesn't allow compromise into his walk with God? We lose out on courtesy, just being nice, respectfully disagreeing with people. That's what courtesy is. We lose out on humility. You know what happens when we don't have community where our challenges are perspective? We all think we're the experts, right? We've done the research. We know what's right and wrong. And we lose out on humility where we actually, this is what I think humility looks like in the 21st century here in Leamington. It's saying, you know what? You have a completely different political ideology than me, and I still think that you can love Jesus wholeheartedly. That's what humility looks like in the body of Christ. We miss out without community on mercy. I've noticed this in my life. I'm quicker to judge you when I haven't been around you for a long time. But when I hang out with you, I'm like, oh man, they're such great people. I empathize with what they're going through. I'm praying for them, right? We also miss out on unity, where we say, you know what? We are the body of Christ. We're brothers and sisters. We're in this together. All of these things are lost when we disregard community and we live as individuals. And so our prayer is that we would grow in community this fall, even if it's difficult, even if it's challenging. Why don't you stand up to your feet? We're going to pray together, and then I'm going to release you to do something really unhealthy, and that's go eat a whole bunch of hot dogs, all right? Pastor Michael is waiting for you. He wants to challenge some of you adults to the inflatable obstacle course. Feel free to have a great time. God, I thank you for this church family. I thank you that I get to be a part of it. It's a privilege to lead them as their pastor. I pray you would bless them and protect them and guide them in the weeks to come. Unite us as a church family. And as we talk about starting next week, send us out on mission to make a difference for you, I pray. And everyone said, amen. God bless you guys. Have a great afternoon.